Have you ever wondered why certain ancient texts were deliberately excluded from the Bible? Why entire chapters of human history seem to have vanished into the shadows of time? And why some names that should echo through the ages have been whispered only in forbidden corners? What if I told you that before Eve, before the Garden of Eden as we know it, there was another woman, a figure so controversial, so dangerous to established doctrine, that her story was systematically erased from sacred history? Her name was Lilith, and she wasn't just Adam's first companion. She was his equal, his match, and perhaps his greatest spiritual challenge. But here's where it gets absolutely mind-blowing. Lilith's story doesn't just change how we understand the beginning of humanity. It reveals a hidden layer of Genesis that most people have never encountered. It exposes questions that religious scholars have debated in secret for centuries. And it unveils truths about the nature of creation itself that might completely transform your understanding of Scripture and human origins. Now, before we dive deep into this mystery, I need you to do something. Leave 7 sevens in the comments if you're ready to discover truths that have been hidden for millennia, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button, because what you're about to learn will take you on a journey that most people never get to experience. Trust me, this revelation will challenge everything you thought you knew about the very beginning of our story. So who was Lilith really, and why was her existence considered so threatening that it had to be buried beneath centuries of silence? Let's uncover the forbidden truth together. The mystery of Lilith begins in the spaces between verses, in the silences that speak louder than words, and in the ancient manuscripts that were deemed too dangerous for common eyes to see. While most of us grew up hearing the familiar story of Adam and Eve, few ever learned that this narrative might be incomplete, that there could be chapters missing from the very foundation of human history. Imagine if you discovered that the story you'd been told your entire life was only half the truth. Imagine learning that, before the woman made from Adam's rib, there was another woman, one who emerged from the same dust, the same divine breath, the same creative act that brought forth the first man. This woman wasn't a helper or a companion created to serve. She was an equal, a partner formed with the same materials and the same divine intention. Her name appears in whispers throughout ancient literature in texts that were once considered sacred, but later pushed to the margins of religious study. Lilith emerges from the shadows of history, like a ghost from humanity's forgotten past, and her story challenges everything. We think we know about creation, about relationships, about the very nature of what it means to be human, but why would such a story be hidden? Why would the narrative of humanity's first woman be deliberately obscured? And what does her existence reveal about the deeper mysteries of Genesis that have been concealed from us for thousands of years? The answers to these questions don't just satisfy curiosity. They unlock a completely different understanding of our origins. To understand Lilith, we must first journey back to the very beginning, not just to the familiar garden, but to the moments before Eden, when the earth was still forming, when divine hands were shaping the first forms of life, and when the blueprint for humanity was being written in ways that would echo through eternity. In the book of Genesis, chapter 1, verse 27, we encounter words that have puzzled scholars for generations. So God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created the male and female. He created them. Notice something crucial here. Both male and female were created together simultaneously from the same divine act. This isn't the story of Eve being formed from Adam's rib that comes later in chapter 2. This is something else entirely, something that suggests a different beginning. What if this verse isn't just poetic language? What if it's describing a literal truth that both the first man and the first woman emerged together from the dust of the earth, equal in their creation, equal in their divine image, equal in their purpose and calling? Could it be that Lilith represents this first woman, the one who was created alongside Adam, before the more familiar story of Eve's creation from his side? Ancient Hebrew texts and rabbinical writings preserve fragments of this alternative narrative. They speak of a first woman who refused to be subordinate, who demanded equality, who would not bow down or submit to authority that she believed was unjustly imposed upon her. These texts describe conflicts between the first man and first woman disputes that arose not from disobedience to God, but from disagreements about their relationship to each other. According to these ancient sources, Lilith and Adam were both formed from the red earth of the ground. Both received the breath of life directly from the divine source. Both were given dominion and authority over the creatures of the earth. But while Adam seemed content with the arrangement, Lilith questioned it. She wondered why she should be considered lesser, why her voice should carry less weight, why her desires and perspectives should be secondary to his. Can you imagine the tension that must have existed in that primordial world? Two beings equal in their creation, yet struggling to understand their relationship to each other. Two souls fresh from the hand of God, yet already grappling with questions of authority, submission, and independence. These weren't questions of rebellion against their creator, but questions about how they should relate to each other as equals. The ancient texts tell us that Lilith possessed a fierce independence, a strong will, and an unwillingness to accept what she perceived as injustice. She wasn't content to simply exist. She wanted to understand her purpose, her place, her rights, and her responsibilities in this new world. She engaged in philosophical debates with Adam, challenging his assumptions, questioning his interpretations, and refusing to accept his word as final simply because he claimed superiority. But here's where the story takes a dramatic turn. According to these preserved fragments, Lilith didn't just argue with Adam, she took action when she could no longer tolerate what she saw as an unjust arrangement. She made a choice that would change the course of human history forever. She spoke the ineffable name of God, the sacred name that carried divine power and authority. And with that invocation, she rose up from the earth and flew away. This act wasn't just physical departure, it was spiritual rebellion. Not against God, but against a system that she believed diminished her divine nature. Lilith refused to accept a secondary role in creation. When she knew she had been formed as an equal, she wouldn't pretend to be less than what she was simply to maintain peace or preserve the status quo. Her departure represented the first assertion of individual will in human history. Where did she go? The ancient sources tell us that Lilith fled to the shores of the Red Sea, a place that would later become associated with transition, transformation, and divine intervention. It was there, in that liminal space between land and water, between the known and the unknown, that she established her own domain. There she lived not as a subordinate, but as a sovereign, being making her own choices and following her own path. But the story doesn't end with her departure, because according to these texts, God wasn't content to let her remain in exile. 3 angels were sent to find her and bring her back. Senoi Sansenoi and Samangelof. These messengers of the divine carried an ultimatum return to Adam, and accept your place or face consequences that would affect not just you, but generations to come. When the angels found Lilith by the Red Sea, they delivered their message, but her response was both defiant and prophetic. She refused to return. She wouldn't go back to a situation she considered unjust, but she also accepted the consequences of her choice with a dignity that reveals the depth of her character. She knew that her decision would cost her dearly, yet she maintained her position, that equality and justice were worth any price. This refusal to return, this insistence on maintaining her dignity and her rights, even in the face of divine pressure, shows us something profound about Lilith's character. She wasn't motivated by selfishness or pride, but by a deep conviction that she deserved to be treated as the equal she was created to be. Her story becomes not just one of rebellion, but one of the first struggle for justice and equality in human history. And so Lilith remained in exile, choosing freedom over security, independence over comfort, justice over peace. She became a figure of both tragedy and triumph, a woman who refused to compromise her principles Even when the cost was everything she held dear, her story was preserved in fragments whispered in shadows, remembered by those who understood that sometimes the most important truths are the ones that make us uncomfortable. But why was this story considered so dangerous? Why was it pushed to the margins of religious teaching? Why did Lilith become a figure to be feared rather than understood? The answers to these questions reveal as much about human nature and religious interpretation as they do about this mysterious first woman, because Lilith's story challenges assumptions that many found too threatening to confront. Her narrative suggests that equality between men and women was part of the original divine design. It implies that submission and hierarchy might be human constructs rather than divine mandates. It raises questions about authority, interpretation, and the right to make choices based on conscience rather than tradition. These ideas were revolutionary in ancient times and remain challenging today. So as we continue to uncover the mystery of Lilith, we must ask ourselves what other truths might have been hidden. What other stories might have been buried beneath centuries of interpretation and reinterpretation? What other voices might have been silenced because their message was too powerful, too challenging, too transformative for the established order to embrace? The story of Lilith is more than just an alternative creation narrative. It's a mirror that reflects our own struggles with equality, justice, and the courage to stand up for what we believe is right. Even when the cost is high, even when we stand alone, even when the world tells us we're wrong. Her legacy lives on, not just in ancient texts, but in every person who refuses to accept injustice, who demands to be treated with dignity, who insists that their voice deserves to be heard. What happens when you refuse to bow down? When you choose your principles over peace? When you decide that your dignity is worth more than your comfort? Lilith's choice to remain by the Red Sea wasn't just an act of defiance. It was the birth of something that would echo through human consciousness for millennia, the archetype of the woman who refuses to be diminished, who will not accept less than what she knows she deserves. But the consequences of her decision were far more complex than simple exile, because according to the ancient texts that preserve her story, Lilith's departure from Eden created a void that needed to be filled. Adam was alone again, and this time, God would take a different approach to creating his companion. Instead of forming another woman from the dust of the earth, as an equal, God would create Eve from Adam's own body, ensuring a connection that couldn't be severed, a bond that couldn't be broken through independence or rebellion. This is where the familiar story begins, the one we all know about the woman made from man's rib, the helper designed to complement rather than compete, the partner who would walk alongside rather than challenge or question. But even this more familiar narrative carries traces of the earlier story shadows of what came before whispers of the woman who came first. Have you ever wondered why the creation account in Genesis seems to have two different versions? Why chapter 1 speaks of male and female being created together, while chapter 2 tells the story of Eve being formed from Adam's rib? What if these aren't contradictory accounts, but sequential ones? What if they're describing two separate creations, two different women, two distinct approaches to solving the problem of human companionship? The rabbinical texts that preserve Lilith's story suggest exactly this, that Genesis 1 describes the creation of Lilith alongside Adam, while Genesis 2 describes the later creation of Eve after Lilith's departure. This interpretation explains the apparent inconsistencies in the biblical narrative and provides a framework for understanding why certain details seem to contradict each other. But Lilith's influence on human history didn't end with her exile from Eden, because the ancient sources tell us that she didn't simply disappear into obscurity. Instead, she became something else entirely, something that would haunt human imagination for thousands of years. She transformed from the first woman into the first rebel, from Adam's equal into something far more complex and mysterious. In the texts that were later deemed apocryphal, Lilith becomes associated with the night, with dreams and visions, with the spaces between waking and sleeping, where reality becomes fluid and anything seems possible. She's described as a figure who moves through darkness, not as evil incarnate, but as a force of untamed, feminine power. A reminder of what was lost when equality was sacrificed for harmony. These descriptions paint Lilith not as a demon, but as a guardian of feminine independence, a protector of women who refuse to be silenced, a spirit that whispers to those who find themselves trapped in situations where their voices aren't heard or their worth isn't recognized. She becomes the patron saint of the rebellious, the advocate for those who choose the difficult path of authenticity over the easier road of compliance. But why did later interpretations transform her from a figure of independence into something to be feared? Why did Lilith evolve from humanity's first advocate for equality into a creature of darkness and terror? The answer lies in the uncomfortable truth that her story represented a challenge to established power structures that lasted far beyond the ancient world. As religious and social systems developed over centuries, the idea of a woman who refused to submit, who demanded equality, who chose exile over compromise, became increasingly threatening. Lilith's story suggested that women had always possessed the right to make their own choices, that feminine independence wasn't a modern invention, but an ancient birthright that had been suppressed rather than naturally absent, so the narrative began to change. Lilith was no longer described as a woman standing up for her rights, but as a dangerous seductress who threatened the natural order. She wasn't a figure of justice, but of chaos, not a symbol of equality, but of rebellion against divine will. This transformation served a purpose. It warned women against following her example. It suggested that independence led to corruption, that equality resulted in destruction. Yet even in these later, more negative portrayals, something of Lilith's original power remained. She was still depicted as intelligent, still shown as capable of making her own decisions, still portrayed as someone who couldn't be controlled or dominated. The very qualities that made her threatening were also the qualities that made her compelling. And this brings us to one of the most fascinating aspects of Lilith's story: the way it has survived despite centuries of suppression, despite attempts to erase her from official religious narratives. Despite the transformation of her image from liberator to destroyer, her name has persisted, her story has endured, her influence has continued to shape human consciousness in ways both obvious and subtle. In medieval Jewish folklore, Lilith appears as a complex figure, neither wholly good nor entirely evil, but something more nuanced and human. She's described as beautiful and terrible, wise and dangerous, powerful and tragic. These contradictions reflect the complexity of her original story, the way she embodies both the promise and the peril of absolute independence. The medieval texts tell us that Lilith became the queen of her own realm, ruling over spirits and shadows, presiding over the liminal spaces where the physical and spiritual worlds intersect. She's described as having the power to shape-shift, to appear in dreams, to influence the boundary between conscious and unconscious experience. This isn't the portrait of a simple demon, but of a being who transcended the ordinary limitations of existence. What's particularly striking about these medieval accounts is how they preserve elements of Lilith's original characterization, even while casting her in a more sinister light. She's still portrayed as refusing to submit, still shown as making her own choices, still depicted as someone who would rather rule in exile than serve in paradise. These core elements of her personality remained consistent, even as the interpretation of those qualities shifted from positive to negative. But perhaps the most revealing aspect of Lilith's medieval transformation is how it reflects the fears and anxieties of the societies that preserved her story. The qualities that made her threatening weren't actually evil. They were simply powerful, and in a world where feminine power was seen as dangerous, her strength became evidence of her corruption. Her independence became proof of her rebellion against the natural order. Yet even these negative interpretations couldn't entirely erase the appeal of her story, because at its heart, Lilith's narrative speaks to something fundamental in human nature: the desire for dignity, the need for respect, the refusal to accept injustice, even when acceptance would be easier. These aren't evil impulses, they're some of the most noble aspects of human character. And this creates a fascinating paradox in how Lilith has been perceived throughout history. She's simultaneously feared and admired, reviled and respected, seen as both a cautionary tale and an inspiration, depending on the perspective of those encountering her story. The same qualities that make her a villain in some narratives make her a hero in others. This dual nature of Lilith's legacy reveals something profound about how we interpret stories of rebellion and independence. When someone challenges established authority, we tend to see them either as dangerous revolutionaries or courageous reformers, depending on whether we benefit from the system they're challenging. Lilith's story forces us to examine our own assumptions about power, authority, and the right to resist. As we trace her influence through centuries of human culture, we begin to see how her archetype has appeared and reappeared in countless forms, sometimes explicitly as references to her story, sometimes implicitly as echoes of her character. The woman who refuses to be silenced, who demands to be treated as an equal, who chooses difficult freedom over comfortable submission, appears throughout literature, art, and social movements. But what does all of this mean for us today? Why should we care about an ancient story that may or may not be historically accurate? Why does Lilith's narrative continue to resonate with people across cultures and centuries? What can her story teach us about ourselves and our own struggles with justice, equality, and the courage to stand up for what we believe? The answer lies in understanding that Lilith's story isn't really about one woman's rebellion against one man's authority. It's about the eternal human struggle between conformity and authenticity, between peace and justice, between the safety of acceptance and the risk of standing alone for what we believe is right. These are challenges that every generation faces, that every individual must navigate. Lilith represents the part of us that refuses to accept injustice, that demands to be treated with dignity, that insists our voices deserve to be heard. She embodies the courage to choose the difficult path, when the easy one requires us to compromise our principles, to diminish ourselves, to accept less than what we know we deserve. Her story reminds us that sometimes the most important battles aren't against external enemies, but against internal pressures to conform, to submit, to accept the unacceptable in the name of keeping peace or maintaining relationships. Lilith chose to stand alone rather than stand diminished, and in doing so, she became a symbol of the strength required to live authentically. And this brings us to perhaps the most startling discovery about Lilith's story: the way it has been preserved, not just in obscure ancient texts, but woven into the very fabric of mystical traditions that have shaped human spirituality for thousands of years. Because what most people don't realize is that Lilith's influence extends far beyond Jewish folklore, far beyond medieval superstitions, and reaches into the heart of esoteric wisdom that has guided seekers and mystics throughout history. In the Kabbalah, the mystical tradition of Jewish spirituality, Lilith appears as a figure of profound complexity, representing forces that are neither purely good nor purely evil, but something far more nuanced and powerful. She embodies the untamed feminine divine, the aspect of creation that refuses to be controlled or contained by human understanding. This isn't the domesticated spirituality of organized religion, but the wild primordial force that existed before rules were established, before hierarchies were created. The Kabbalistic texts describe Lilith as dwelling in the realm of the Qliphoth, the shadow side of the tree of life, where broken vessels and rejected aspects of creation find their home. But here's what's fascinating about this placement. She isn't described as fallen or corrupted, but as necessary, as representing aspects of divine truth that are too intense, too challenging, too transformative for ordinary consciousness to handle. This mystical understanding of Lilith reveals something profound about the nature of spiritual truth. that sometimes the most important aspects of divine reality are the ones that make us uncomfortable, that challenge our assumptions, that force us to expand beyond our limited understanding of how things should be. The mystics understood that Lilith's refusal to submit wasn't rebellion against God, but a different way of serving divine truth. What emerges from these mystical texts is a portrait of Lilith as a teacher, a figure who forces confrontation with shadow aspects of existence that must be acknowledged and integrated, rather than denied or suppressed. She represents the parts of ourselves and our spiritual traditions that we've rejected or hidden the voices. We've silenced the truths we've found too difficult to accept. But the mystical traditions go even further in their understanding of Lilith's role. They suggest that her departure from Eden wasn't a tragedy, but a necessity, that her refusal to submit created space for a different kind of spiritual development, one that couldn't have occurred if she had remained and accepted a subordinate position. Her exile becomes not punishment, but transformation. According to these deeper teachings, Lilith's time by the Red Sea wasn't spent in bitterness or regret, but in developing powers and understanding that could only emerge from complete independence, from total self-reliance, from the willingness to face the darkness alone. This period of exile becomes a spiritual initiation, a process of becoming that transforms her from Adam's equal into something far more powerful and mysterious. The mystical texts describe how during her exile, Lilith learned to navigate realms of existence that others couldn't access, how she developed abilities to move between worlds, to see through illusions, to understand the hidden connections that bind all things together. Her independence wasn't just political or social, but spiritual. She became a master of her own destiny in ways that those who remained in paradise could never achieve. And this brings us to one of the most controversial aspects of Lilith's mystical portrayal: her relationship with the divine itself, because unlike the familiar narrative where rebellion against authority equals rebellion against God, the mystical traditions suggest something radically different. They propose that Lilith's actions were actually in alignment with a deeper divine will, that her refusal to submit was itself a form of sacred service. This interpretation challenges everything we think we know about obedience and rebellion, about what it means to serve the divine will, about whether conformity and submission are always virtuous. The mystical understanding suggests that sometimes the most sacred act is to refuse to accept what appears to be divine command, when that command contradicts the deeper truth of our divine nature. Imagine the implications of this perspective. Imagine what it means to suggest that Lilith's departure from Eden was actually part of a larger divine plan, that her exile was necessary for the full expression of creation to unfold, that her refusal to submit opened doorways to spiritual understanding that couldn't have been accessed any other way. This isn't just a different interpretation of her story. It's a complete transformation of what rebellion and obedience mean. The mystical texts go on to describe how Lilith's influence continued to shape human spiritual development throughout history, how her archetype appears whenever someone must choose between comfortable conformity and difficult authenticity, whenever a soul must decide whether to accept limitations or break free into unknown possibilities. She becomes the patron of all who choose the path of spiritual independence. But here's where the story becomes even more intriguing, because the mystical traditions don't just preserve Lilith's memory, they suggest that her influence is still active, still available to those who seek to understand the deeper mysteries of existence. She isn't just a historical figure, but a living archetype, a spiritual force that continues to guide and challenge those who encounter her story. This active presence of Lilith in mystical experience explains why her story has survived despite centuries of suppression, why it continues to emerge in new forms, why people across cultures and generations find themselves drawn to her narrative, even when they don't fully understand why she represents something that can't be destroyed or erased, because it's woven into the very fabric of human spiritual possibility. The mystical understanding of Lilith also reveals why her story was considered so dangerous by established religious authorities. Because it suggests that spiritual truth isn't always found through submission and obedience, that sometimes the most sacred path requires us to stand alone, to question authority, to choose exile over compromise. These ideas threaten any system that depends on unquestioning compliance. What's particularly fascinating about the mystical portrayal of Lilith is how it reconciles her apparent rebellion with divine service by suggesting that true service to the divine sometimes requires us to rebel against human interpretations of divine will, that authentic spirituality demands we honor the divine spark within ourselves, even when others tell us that spark is dangerous or wrong. This understanding transforms Lilith from a cautionary tale into a guide for spiritual seekers, from a symbol of what not to do into an example of the courage required for authentic spiritual development. She becomes the patron saint of all who must choose between external approval and internal truth, between the safety of conformity and the risk of living authentically. And this brings us to perhaps the most profound aspect of Lilith's mystical significance: the way her story illuminates the relationship between masculine and feminine aspects of divine consciousness, because her conflict with Adam wasn't really about gender in the biological sense, but about different approaches to spiritual truth, different ways of relating to divine authority, different understandings of what it means to be created in the divine image. The mystical traditions suggest that Lilith represents the feminine divine, in its wild, untamed form, the aspect of spiritual truth that refuses to be domesticated or controlled, while Eve represents the feminine divine, in its nurturing, supportive form. Both are necessary. Both are sacred, but they serve different functions in the unfolding of spiritual consciousness. This understanding reveals that the apparent conflict between Lilith and Adam represents a cosmic tension that exists within all of us, the tension between the part of us that seeks harmony and the part that demands justice, between the aspect that wants to belong and the aspect that insists on authenticity, between the impulse to conform and the impulse to transform. When we understand Lilith's story from this mystical perspective, it becomes clear why it has remained so compelling throughout history, why it continues to speak to people who are struggling with questions of identity, authority, and spiritual authenticity. Her narrative provides a framework for understanding these internal conflicts not as personal failings, but as cosmic forces that shape all spiritual development. The mystical Lilith doesn't offer easy answers or comfortable solutions. She represents the path that requires us to face our shadows, to question our assumptions, to choose growth over security. She embodies the understanding that sometimes spiritual development requires us to leave behind everything familiar, everything safe, everything that others expect of us. But perhaps most importantly, the mystical understanding of Lilith reveals that her story isn't really about the past at all, but about the eternal present, about choices that every soul must make, about the courage required to live authentically, about the price and the promise of choosing truth over comfort. Her exile by the Red Sea becomes a metaphor for every moment when we must decide who we really are. And as we begin to understand the deeper layers of Lilith's story, as we see how her narrative has been preserved and transformed through millennia of human spiritual seeking, we start to realize that her influence extends far beyond ancient texts, far beyond religious folklore, into the very heart of what it means to be human, what it means to seek truth, what it means to choose authenticity, even when the cost is everything we hold dear, because ultimately Lilith's story is our story. Her choices are our choices. Her courage or her failure becomes a mirror for our own spiritual journey. And in understanding her narrative, we begin to understand something fundamental about the nature of consciousness itself, about the eternal tension between conformity and transformation, about the price and the promise of choosing to become who we really are. The deeper we venture into Lilith's mystical significance, the more we discover that her story intersects with prophecies and visions that stretch far beyond her initial departure from Eden. Because the ancient seers and prophets who preserved her narrative, understood something that modern interpretations often miss: that her exile wasn't an ending, but a beginning. That her refusal to submit opened doorways to realms of existence that would shape the spiritual destiny of humanity itself. In the prophetic traditions that emerged from the mystical understanding of her story, Lilith becomes associated with the end times, with the final transformation of consciousness that must occur before humanity can fully realize its divine potential. She represents the force that will awaken those who have been sleeping, the voice that will call out to those who have forgotten their true nature, the power that will shatter the illusions that have kept souls trapped in systems of spiritual oppression. These prophetic visions describe a time when the energy that Lilith embodies will no longer be confined to the shadows, will no longer be whispered about in secret, will no longer be feared by those who cling to outdated structures of authority. Instead, her archetype will emerge into full manifestation, calling forth a generation of souls who refuse to accept spiritual limitation, who demand authentic relationship with the divine, who choose transformation over comfort. What makes these prophecies particularly compelling is how they describe this awakening not as something imposed from outside, but as something that emerges from within the recognition that the Lilith energy has always been present in human consciousness, waiting for the moment when enough souls would be ready to embrace the difficult path of authentic spiritual development. The prophetic texts speak of a time when the questions Lilith raised in Eden will finally be answered, when the tension between submission and equality will be resolved not through domination, but through a higher understanding that transcends the limitations of hierarchical thinking. This isn't about women overthrowing men or rebels defeating authorities, but about consciousness itself, evolving beyond the need for such primitive power structures. Imagine what this means for our understanding of spiritual evolution. Imagine the implications of prophecies that suggest Lilith's exile was actually preparation for a future role in humanity's awakening, that her time by the Red Sea was spent developing the wisdom and power necessary to guide souls through the final transformation of consciousness. These aren't just ancient stories, but blueprints for understanding the spiritual challenges of our own time. The prophetic visions describe how recognition of Lilith's true nature will serve as a catalyst for widespread spiritual awakening, how her story will help people understand that authentic relationship with the divine requires the courage to question authority, to think independently, to choose truth over tradition. When the two come into conflict, her narrative becomes a teaching tool for souls who are ready to graduate from spiritual childhood into spiritual maturity. But these prophecies also warn of the resistance that will emerge as Lilith's energy becomes more active in human consciousness, because systems built on domination and control cannot survive when people begin to recognize their inherent dignity and worth. The awakening that her archetype represents threatens every structure that depends on keeping souls small, fearful, and dependent. This prophetic understanding of Lilith's role reveals why her story has been so consistently suppressed throughout history, why religious and political authorities have worked so hard to transform her from a symbol of dignity into a figure of fear, because they understood intuitively that her narrative contained the seeds of their own obsolescence, that widespread recognition of what she represents would make their control impossible to maintain. The prophecies describe this awakening as unstoppable once it begins, like a fire that spreads from soul to soul, igniting recognition of divine worth that can never again be extinguished. They speak of a time when the courage Lilith demonstrated in Eden will be recognized not as rebellion, but as the highest form of service to divine truth, when her refusal to accept injustice will be understood as a model for authentic spiritual living. What emerges from these prophetic visions is our understanding that Lilith's story was never really about the past, but about the future, that her exile from Eden was actually a journey forward in time, to the moment when humanity would be ready to receive the teaching her life represents, when souls would be mature enough to understand that true spiritual development requires the willingness to stand alone for truth. The prophetic texts also reveal that Lilith's influence extends beyond individual awakening into the transformation of human relationships themselves. They describe how recognition of her story will heal the ancient wound between masculine and feminine energies, not by making them identical, but by restoring the recognition that both are equally divine, equally necessary, equally worthy of respect and honor. This healing isn't described as a political or social change, but as a spiritual transformation that occurs when consciousness evolves beyond the need for domination hierarchies. When souls recognize that authentic power comes not from controlling others, but from mastering oneself, not from demanding submission, but from inspiring voluntary cooperation through the demonstration of wisdom and love. The prophetic understanding of Lilith's role in this transformation reveals her as a bridge between the old consciousness based on fear and control and the new consciousness based on love and mutual recognition. She represents the courage required to leave behind familiar but limiting patterns, to venture into unknown territory guided only by inner truth and divine connection. These visions also describe how Lilith's energy will manifest in practical ways through individuals who embody her archetype, people who refuse to accept spiritual limitation, who question religious authority when it contradicts divine truth, who choose authenticity over approval, who are willing to stand alone rather than compromise their connection to the sacred. What's particularly striking about these prophetic descriptions is how they portray this manifestation not as dramatic or revolutionary, but as natural and inevitable, like seeds that have been planted, finally reaching maturity, like dawn breaking after a long night, like rivers finding their way to the sea. The awakening that Lilith represents is described as the natural result of consciousness evolution. The prophecies speak of recognition spreading through humanity like ripples in a pond as more souls encounter her story and recognize themselves in her choices. As people begin to understand that the qualities that made her threatening to ancient authorities are actually the qualities necessary for spiritual maturity: courage, independence, authentic relationship with the divine willingness to choose truth over comfort. But perhaps most importantly, these prophetic visions reveal that Lilith's ultimate purpose isn't to destroy or overthrow existing structures, but to transform them from within, to help consciousness evolve beyond the need for domination hierarchies, to demonstrate that authentic spiritual authority comes not from position or power, but from wisdom, love, and genuine service to divine truth. This understanding transforms our perception of what prophecy itself means, because these visions of Lilith's role in humanity's awakening aren't predictions of external events, but descriptions of internal transformations that occur when souls mature beyond the need for external validation. When individuals develop the courage to live authentically regardless of social pressure, the prophetic Lilith becomes a guide for navigating this transformation, a model for the kind of courage and independence required to participate in humanity's spiritual evolution. Her story provides a framework for understanding the challenges that arise when we choose growth over security, when we decide to honor our divine nature, even when others tell us it's dangerous or wrong. As these prophetic understandings of Lilith's story spread through modern spiritual communities, we begin to see her influence manifesting in new ways through individuals who embody her archetype, through movements that challenge spiritual authority, through awakenings that prioritize authentic relationship with the divine over religious conformity. What becomes clear is that Lilith's story isn't just ancient history, but living prophecy, a narrative that continues to unfold through every soul who chooses dignity over submission, authenticity over approval, truth over tradition. Her exile from Eden becomes a metaphor for every spiritual journey that requires us to leave behind the familiar and venture into the unknown, guided only by inner knowing. The prophetic dimensions of her story reveal that consciousness itself is evolving, that humanity is gradually awakening to truths that have always been present but were too challenging for earlier generations to embrace, that we are living in the time when Lilith's questions will finally be answered, when her courage will finally be understood, when her choice will finally be vindicated. And this brings us to a stunning realization that the story we've been exploring isn't really about one woman's rebellion in an ancient garden, but about the eternal process of spiritual awakening itself, about the courage required to choose authenticity, about the price and promise of living in alignment with divine truth, regardless of external pressure. Because ultimately, the prophecies surrounding Lilith reveal that her story is our story, that her choices are the choices every awakening soul must make, that her courage or failure becomes a mirror for our own spiritual development, and that in understanding her narrative, we begin to understand something fundamental about the nature of consciousness, evolution itself. The prophetic Lilith doesn't offer us easy answers or comfortable solutions. She represents the path that requires us to face our deepest fears, to question our most fundamental assumptions, to choose growth, even when it means leaving behind everything familiar and secure. But she also represents the promise that awaits those who have the courage to make such choices as we continue to explore the deeper dimensions of her story, as we begin to understand how her narrative connects with prophecies of consciousness transformation. We start to realize that we're not just studying ancient texts, but participating in the very awakening that those texts describe, living out the spiritual evolution that her story was always meant to inspire. And this prophetic understanding of Lilith leads us to perhaps the most shocking revelation of all. Hidden within the most ancient texts preserved by mystics and scholars are descriptions of encounters that suggest her influence never truly disappeared. Throughout history, there have been individuals who claim direct contact with this primordial feminine force. Her exile by the Red Sea was not isolation, but preparation for ongoing involvement in human spiritual development. These accounts scattered across centuries and cultures describe visionary experiences where seekers encountered a figure matching Lilith's description, not as a demon or evil spirit, but as a teacher of profound wisdom. Someone who appears to souls ready to embrace the difficult path of authentic spiritual growth. These encounters typically occur during moments of spiritual crisis, when individuals must choose between conformity and truth, between safety and authenticity. What makes these accounts particularly compelling is their consistency across different time periods and geographical locations. The figure described possesses the same characteristics that define Lilith in the earliest texts: fierce independence, unwavering commitment to truth, willingness to challenge authority, refusal to accept diminishment of divine nature. These aren't coincidental similarities, but evidence of a continuing presence that transcends normal historical boundaries. The medieval mystics who documented such encounters described them as initiations, moments when the soul must confront its deepest fears, about standing alone for truth, about choosing the narrow path that few dare to walk, about embracing aspects of divine nature that society has labeled dangerous or forbidden. These visionary experiences become tests of spiritual maturity, opportunities to demonstrate readiness for advanced understanding. During the Renaissance period, when questioning religious authority became more common, reports of Lilith encounters increased dramatically, appearing in the private journals of philosophers, alchemists, and spiritual seekers who were challenging established doctrines. These individuals described receiving guidance about how to maintain authenticity while navigating hostile environments, how to preserve inner truth while outwardly conforming to social expectations. The Enlightenment era brought new forms of these encounters as rational thinking began to challenge traditional religious interpretations. Scientists and philosophers reported dreams and visions featuring a feminine figure who encouraged them to question everything, to trust their own observations over accepted teachings, to choose empirical truth over comfortable beliefs. These experiences often preceded major breakthroughs in understanding. What emerges from studying these historical accounts is a pattern that suggests Lilith's influence manifests most strongly During periods of collective spiritual transition, when humanity stands at crossroads between old and new paradigms, when souls must choose between clinging to familiar limitations and embracing unknown possibilities, her presence seems to intensify whenever consciousness is ready for evolutionary leaps. But these encounters aren't limited to famous historical figures, because the mystics understood that Lilith's influence extends to anyone willing to embrace the path of authentic spiritual development. The accounts describe ordinary individuals who found themselves face to face with this primordial archetype, during moments when they had to choose between external approval and internal truth. The consistent elements in these encounters reveal fascinating insights about how this ancient feminine force continues to operate in human consciousness. She appears most often during dreams or meditation, when the rational mind is quiet and deeper truths can emerge. She communicates not through words but through direct transmission of understanding about dignity, courage, and the right to live authentically. These visionary experiences typically include challenges or tests where the individual must demonstrate their commitment to truth over comfort, their willingness to stand alone rather than compromise their divine nature, their readiness to accept the consequences of choosing authenticity. These aren't arbitrary trials, but necessary preparations for the kind of spiritual independence that Lilith herself embodies. What's particularly striking about modern accounts of such encounters is how they often occur to individuals who have never heard of Lilith, who know nothing about her story, yet describe meeting a figure who matches her characteristics perfectly and receiving guidance that aligns with her archetypal message. This suggests that her influence operates at levels deeper than cultural knowledge, at the fundamental level of human spiritual DNA. Contemporary spiritual seekers who document these experiences describe receiving insights about the nature of divine feminine energy, about the importance of questioning religious authority, about the necessity of choosing personal truth over social conformity. These modern encounters carry the same themes that appear in accounts spanning centuries, revealing the timeless relevance of Lilith's teaching. The psychological impact of these encounters is consistently described as transformative. Individuals report increased courage to live authentically, greater willingness to challenge unjust authority, deeper connection to their own divine nature, and reduced fear of standing alone for their convictions. These aren't temporary emotional experiences, but permanent shifts in consciousness that align with Lilith's original message. Researchers studying these phenomena have noted that encounters with Lilith's archetype often precede major life transitions periods, when individuals must leave behind limiting relationships, situations, or belief systems that no longer serve their highest good. Her appearance seems to herald moments when souls are ready to graduate to higher levels of spiritual independence. What makes these contemporary accounts particularly relevant is how they describe receiving guidance about navigating modern challenges while maintaining ancient wisdom, how to preserve authentic spirituality in a world dominated by institutional religion, how to honor divine feminine energy in cultures that still fear independent women, how to choose truth in environments that reward conformity. The encounters consistently emphasize that Lilith's energy isn't about rebellion for its own sake, but about the courage required to honor divine truth, even when that truth challenges accepted norms. Her influence helps individuals distinguish between healthy questioning of authority and destructive rebellion, between authentic independence and selfish individualism. These modern visionary experiences also reveal how Lilith's archetype is adapting to address contemporary spiritual challenges, appearing to individuals struggling with religious trauma, offering guidance to those questioning gender roles in spirituality, providing support for people who feel called to paths that don't fit traditional expectations. The accounts describe receiving understanding about how to integrate masculine and feminine energies within oneself, how to balance independence with relationship, how to maintain spiritual authenticity while participating in society, how to honor both individual truth and collective harmony. These aren't ancient problems, but current challenges that require the wisdom Lilith represents. What emerges from studying both historical and contemporary accounts of these encounters is recognition that Lilith's influence represents a continuing force in human spiritual evolution, not a relic from the past, but an active presence that appears whenever souls are ready to embrace the difficult path of authentic development. The consistency of these reports across cultures and centuries suggests that we're dealing with something more than psychological projection or cultural myth, but with a genuine archetypal force that continues to guide human consciousness toward greater authenticity, independence, and direct relationship with divine truth. These encounters also reveal that Lilith's teaching isn't limited to women, but extends to anyone regardless of gender who must choose between conformity and authenticity. Her influence appears to individuals of all backgrounds who are ready to embrace the courage required for genuine spiritual independence. The accounts consistently describe these encounters as both challenging and empowering, demanding that individuals take full responsibility for their spiritual development, while providing the inner strength necessary to walk the path alone if necessary. This balance between challenge and support reflects the nature of authentic spiritual teaching. What becomes clear from studying these visionary experiences is that Lilith's influence continues to manifest in human consciousness, because the challenges she originally faced in Eden remain relevant today. The questions she raised about equality, dignity, and authentic relationship with the divine are still being asked by souls ready to embrace spiritual maturity. The modern encounters also reveal how her archetype is evolving, addressing contemporary issues while maintaining core principles of independence, authenticity, and direct divine connection. Her influence adapts to each generation's specific challenges while preserving timeless wisdom about the courage required to live according to inner truth. As we examine these accounts of ongoing contact with Lilith's archetypal energy, we begin to understand that her story isn't contained within ancient texts, but continues to unfold through every individual who chooses authenticity over approval, who stands up for truth despite opposition, who refuses to diminish their divine nature to make others comfortable. The encounters consistently reveal that accessing Lilith's wisdom requires genuine readiness to embrace the difficult path of spiritual independence, willingness to question everything, including one's own assumptions, courage to stand alone when necessary, and commitment to truth regardless of personal cost. These aren't casual requirements, but the price of authentic spiritual development. What emerges most powerfully from these accounts is recognition that Lilith's influence represents an invitation to spiritual adulthood, to graduation from dependence on external authority, to development of direct personal relationship with divine truth. This isn't rebellion against the sacred, but rebellion against human interpretations that limit access to the sacred. The visionary encounters reveal that her archetype continues to serve as a bridge between old consciousness based on hierarchy and submission, and new consciousness based on mutual recognition and authentic spiritual equality. Her influence helps individuals navigate this transition while maintaining connection to eternal truths. As we continue to explore the deeper dimensions of Lilith's ongoing influence through these documented encounters, we start to realize that we're not just studying historical phenomena, but examining evidence of active spiritual forces that continue to shape human consciousness, evolution itself. Because ultimately, these accounts of contact with Lilith's archetypal energy reveal that her story transcends the boundaries of time and culture, speaking directly to the eternal human need for authenticity, dignity, and genuine relationship with the divine. Her influence continues because the spiritual challenges she represents remain as relevant today as they were in the primordial garden. And this brings us to one of the most extraordinary discoveries about Lilith's continuing influence: the way her archetypal energy has begun manifesting with unprecedented intensity in our current era. According to the mystics and seers who have studied these patterns, we are living in the time prophesied by ancient texts, when the energy she represents would no longer remain hidden in shadows, but would emerge into full manifestation. Modern spiritual communities around the world are reporting dramatic increases in encounters with this primordial feminine archetype. Individuals from completely different backgrounds, cultures, and belief systems are describing remarkably similar experiences of contact with a presence that embodies the very qualities Lilith demonstrated in Eden: independence, courage, unwavering commitment to divine truth, and refusal to accept spiritual diminishment. What makes these contemporary manifestations particularly significant is how they're occurring not just to mystics or advanced spiritual practitioners, but to ordinary people who find themselves suddenly confronted with choices that mirror Lilith's original dilemma. Individuals facing situations where they must choose between conformity and authenticity, between security and truth, between acceptance and dignity. The accounts describe a phenomenon that transcends normal religious or spiritual categories, because this archetypal energy appears to be activating across all belief systems, challenging Christians to question denominational limitations, inspiring Muslims to seek direct divine connection beyond institutional interpretation, encouraging Jews to explore mystical traditions their communities have forgotten, awakening Buddhists to embrace fierce compassion that refuses to tolerate injustice. Contemporary spiritual teachers who work with individuals experiencing these encounters report that the Lilith archetype seems to manifest most powerfully during moments of collective spiritual crisis, when entire societies must choose between clinging to outdated paradigms and embracing evolutionary leaps in consciousness. Her influence intensifies whenever humanity stands at crossroads that require courage to step into unknown territory. What's particularly fascinating about these modern manifestations is how they're not limited to individual experiences, but are beginning to influence collective movements and social transformations. The energy that Lilith represents is becoming visible in grassroots spiritual communities that prioritize authentic experience over institutional authority, in movements that challenge religious hierarchies, in awakenings that emphasize direct divine connection. These contemporary expressions of her archetypal influence reveal patterns that connect directly to her original story. The same refusal to accept unjust authority, the same demand for recognition of inherent divine worth, the same willingness to choose difficult independence over comfortable dependence, the same courage to stand alone when necessary. But now these qualities are manifesting on a scale that suggests widespread consciousness. Transformation. Researchers studying these phenomena have documented how encounters with Lilith's archetype often catalyze what they term spiritual sovereignty, the development of direct personal relationship with divine truth that doesn't require external validation or institutional approval. This isn't rebellion against the sacred, but maturation beyond the need for spiritual intermediaries. The modern manifestations also reveal how this archetypal energy is adapting to address contemporary challenges that didn't exist in ancient times, helping individuals navigate religious trauma caused by authoritarian spiritual systems, providing guidance for those questioning gender limitations in traditional spirituality, offering support for people exploring non-conventional spiritual paths. What emerges from studying these current developments is recognition that we may be witnessing the fulfillment of prophecies embedded within Lilith's original story, the time when the questions she raised about equality, dignity, and authentic divine relationship would finally receive answers, when her courage would be vindicated, when her choice would be understood as necessary for human spiritual evolution. Contemporary accounts describe receiving insights about how to maintain spiritual authenticity in a world that often rewards conformity, how to honor both individual truth and collective harmony, how to integrate ancient wisdom with modern understanding, how to embrace spiritual independence without falling into isolation or arrogance. The manifestations consistently emphasize that accessing this archetypal wisdom requires genuine commitment to personal transformation. willingness to face uncomfortable truths about oneself and one's beliefs, courage to question everything, including one's most cherished assumptions, and readiness to accept the consequences of choosing authenticity over approval. Modern spiritual communities that work consciously with Lilith's archetypal energy report profound transformations in how they approach spiritual development, moving away from hierarchical teacher-student relationships toward collaborative exploration of divine truth, emphasizing personal experience over inherited doctrine, prioritizing authentic practice over traditional forms. These contemporary expressions of her influence also reveal how the archetype is helping individuals heal from spiritual wounds caused by authoritarian religious systems, providing frameworks for reclaiming personal spiritual authority, offering guidance for developing healthy skepticism about claims to exclusive truth, helping people distinguish between authentic spiritual teaching and manipulative control. What's particularly striking about current manifestations is how they're occurring simultaneously across different continents, cultures, and spiritual traditions, suggesting that we're dealing with a global archetypal activation rather than localized phenomena. This widespread emergence implies that humanity may be reaching a collective readiness for the kind of spiritual independence that Lilith represents. The modern encounters consistently describe receiving understanding about the difference between healthy spiritual rebellion and destructive opposition, between authentic independence and selfish individualism, between questioning authority and rejecting all guidance. These distinctions reveal the sophisticated wisdom embedded within her archetypal teaching. Contemporary spiritual practitioners who work with this energy report that it demands rigorous honesty about motivations, requiring individuals to examine whether their spiritual choices are driven by genuine divine connection or by unhealed psychological wounds, whether their independence serves higher truth or personal ego, whether their questioning leads to greater wisdom or mere cynicism. The current manifestations also reveal how Lilith's archetype is addressing modern relationship challenges, helping individuals navigate partnerships that honor both independence and intimacy, providing guidance for creating spiritual communities that balance individual authenticity with collective harmony, offering wisdom for raising children who can think independently while respecting legitimate authority. What emerges most powerfully from these contemporary developments is recognition that the spiritual evolution Lilith's story represents isn't just individual, but collective, that we may be witnessing the emergence of a new form of human consciousness that no longer requires external spiritual authority because it has developed direct access to divine truth. Modern accounts describe this transformation not as dramatic revolutionary change, but as natural maturation, like seeds planted long ago finally reaching full bloom, like dawn gradually replacing darkness, like rivers naturally flowing toward the sea. The awakening that her archetype represents appears to be an inevitable result of consciousness evolution. The contemporary manifestations consistently reveal that this archetypal energy doesn't seek to destroy existing spiritual structures, but to transform them from within, helping religious institutions evolve beyond authoritarian models, inspiring spiritual teachers to embrace collaborative rather than hierarchical approaches, encouraging communities to prioritize authentic experience over inherited tradition. What's particularly significant about current developments is how they're creating bridges between different spiritual traditions as individuals, working with Lilith's archetypal energy, discover that authentic divine connection transcends denominational boundaries, that truth can be found in many forms, that spiritual maturity involves learning from multiple sources. While maintaining discernment, the modern encounters also reveal how this archetypal influence is helping people navigate the challenge of living authentically in societies that often reward conformity, providing strategies for maintaining spiritual integrity in compromising situations, offering guidance for expressing truth in ways that invite rather than alienate, teaching the art of standing firm while remaining open to dialogue. Contemporary spiritual communities report that working consciously with Lilith's archetype creates profound shifts in how they approach spiritual authority, moving from external validation to internal confirmation, from accepting teachings because of who said them to evaluating ideas based on their alignment with experienced truth. From seeking permission to trusting divine guidance, these current manifestations suggest that we are entering a phase of human spiritual development, where the qualities Lilith demonstrated in Eden independence, courage, authentic divine relationship, refusal to accept diminishment are no longer seen as threatening, but as necessary for continued evolution. The accounts consistently describe how accessing this archetypal wisdom requires genuine spiritual maturity. The ability to distinguish between divine truth and human interpretation, between healthy questioning and destructive rebellion, between authentic independence and spiritual bypassing. These requirements ensure that her influence manifests constructively rather than destructively. What becomes clear from studying these contemporary developments is that Lilith's archetype is serving as a catalyst for widespread spiritual awakening, helping individuals recognize their inherent divine worth, inspiring courage to live authentically, providing frameworks for healthy spiritual independence, offering guidance for navigating the challenges of consciousness evolution. The modern manifestations reveal that her influence extends far beyond individual transformation into collective healing, helping humanity move beyond patriarchal spiritual models that diminish feminine divine energy, inspiring new forms of spiritual community that honor both individual authenticity and collective wisdom, catalyzing evolution toward more mature forms of religious expression. As we examine these current developments, we begin to understand that we're not just witnessing random spiritual phenomena, but participating in the unfolding of prophecies embedded within Lilith's original story, living through the time when her questions would be answered, when her courage would be vindicated, when her choice would be recognized as necessary for human spiritual evolution. The contemporary expressions of her archetypal energy reveal that the spiritual challenges she faced in Eden remain relevant today. But now there's a collective readiness to embrace the difficult path of authentic development that didn't exist in earlier eras. Humanity appears to be maturing beyond the need for spiritual authority based on fear and control. What emerges most powerfully from these modern manifestations is recognition that Lilith's story was never really about the past, but about the future. That her exile from Eden was actually a journey forward in time to this moment, when humanity would be ready to receive the teaching her life represents, when souls would be mature enough to choose authenticity over approval. The current archetypal activation suggests that we're living in the prophesied time, when the energy Lilith embodies would no longer be confined to shadows, but would emerge into full manifestation, calling forth a generation of souls ready to embrace spiritual independence, who refuse to accept limitations on their divine nature, who choose transformation over comfort. And this brings us to a stunning realization that the story we've been exploring throughout this journey isn't ancient history, but current events, that the spiritual evolution Lilith represents isn't something that happened long ago, but something that's unfolding right now. Through every individual who chooses authenticity, through every soul who refuses to diminish their divine nature, because ultimately the contemporary manifestations of her archetypal energy reveal that we're all part of this continuing story, that her choices become our choices, that her courage or failure reflects our own spiritual development, and that in understanding her narrative, we begin to understand our own role in the greatest transformation humanity has ever experienced. The contemporary awakening of Lilith's archetypal energy reveals something that challenges everything we thought we knew about the nature of divine feminine power. What's emerging through modern spiritual experiences isn't just individual transformation, but evidence of a cosmic shift that was encoded within her original story from the very beginning. Across the globe, spiritual practitioners are reporting encounters with this primordial feminine force that transcend cultural and religious boundaries. Individuals who have never heard her name are describing meetings with a presence that embodies her exact characteristics: fierce independence, unwavering commitment to truth, absolute refusal to accept spiritual diminishment. These aren't coincidental similarities, but evidence of an archetypal activation that operates beyond normal historical constraints. What makes these contemporary manifestations particularly extraordinary is how they're occurring during humanity's most significant spiritual transition period in recorded history. As old religious structures crumble and new forms of consciousness emerge, the energy that Lilith represents is no longer content to remain hidden in mystical texts or whispered about in secret gatherings. Instead, it's breaking through into mainstream awareness, demanding recognition. The accounts describe a phenomenon that's reshaping how we understand divine feminine energy itself. Because the figure appearing in these modern encounters isn't the domesticated, nurturing feminine that many spiritual traditions have emphasized, but something far more primal and powerful, a force that refuses to be contained, controlled, or diminished by human expectations. This is the untamed aspect of divine consciousness that existed before hierarchies were established. Contemporary spiritual teachers working with individuals experiencing these encounters report that the archetypal energy manifests most powerfully during moments when souls must choose between spiritual authenticity and religious conformity. When people face decisions that mirror Lilith's original dilemma in Eden. Do I honor my direct connection to divine truth, or do I submit to human interpretations that diminish my spiritual nature? The modern expressions of her influence reveal patterns that connect directly to prophecies embedded within mystical traditions that spoke of a time when the energy she embodies would emerge from exile to guide humanity through its final spiritual transformation. These weren't abstract predictions, but descriptions of consciousness evolution that we're witnessing unfold in real time. What's particularly striking about current developments is how this archetypal activation is occurring across all demographic boundaries, affecting individuals regardless of age, gender, cultural background, or previous spiritual experience. The energy appears to be responding to collective readiness for spiritual maturation, rather than individual qualifications or preparations. The encounters consistently describe receiving insights about the difference between authentic spiritual rebellion and destructive opposition, between healthy questioning of authority and cynical rejection of all guidance, between genuine independence and selfish individualism. These distinctions reveal the sophisticated wisdom embedded within her archetypal teaching. Modern spiritual communities that work consciously with this energy report profound transformations in their approach to divine connection, moving away from seeking external validation toward developing internal spiritual authority, emphasizing direct experience over inherited doctrine, prioritizing authentic practice over traditional forms that no longer serve evolutionary purposes. The contemporary manifestations also reveal how Lilith's archetype is addressing challenges that didn't exist in ancient times, helping individuals navigate religious trauma caused by authoritarian spiritual systems, providing frameworks for healing from spiritual abuse, offering guidance for those questioning gender limitations in traditional religious contexts. What emerges from studying these current phenomena is recognition that we may be witnessing the fulfillment of ancient prophecies that described a time when humanity would mature beyond the need for spiritual intermediaries, when direct divine connection would become not just possible, but necessary for continued evolution. The accounts describe this transformation occurring not through dramatic external events, but through quiet internal shifts. As individuals develop the courage to trust their own spiritual experience, to question teachings that contradict their divine nature, to choose authenticity, even when it means standing alone. Contemporary practitioners report that accessing this archetypal wisdom requires genuine commitment to personal transformation, willingness to face uncomfortable truths about inherited beliefs, courage to question everything, including one's most cherished assumptions, readiness to accept the consequences of choosing spiritual authenticity over social approval. The modern encounters reveal how this energy is helping people distinguish between divine truth and human interpretation, between spiritual maturity and religious childishness, between healthy spiritual independence and isolation. These aren't intellectual concepts, but lived experiences that transform how individuals relate to the sacred. What's particularly significant about current manifestations is how they're creating unexpected connections between people from different spiritual backgrounds, as individuals working with Lilith's archetypal energy discover that authentic divine connection transcends denominational boundaries, that truth can be found in many forms while maintaining discerning wisdom. The contemporary expressions of her influence also address modern relationship challenges, helping individuals create partnerships that honor both independence and intimacy, providing guidance for building spiritual communities that balance individual authenticity with collective harmony, offering wisdom for navigating family dynamics. When spiritual awakening creates tension with traditional expectations, modern accounts consistently describe how this archetypal energy doesn't seek to destroy existing spiritual structures, but to transform them from within inspiring religious institutions, to evolve beyond authoritarian models, encouraging spiritual teachers to embrace collaborative rather than hierarchical approaches, helping communities prioritize authentic experience over inherited tradition. The current archetypal activation reveals something profound about the nature of consciousness evolution itself, that spiritual development isn't linear, but cyclical, with ancient wisdom returning in new forms. When humanity is ready to receive deeper understanding, the energy Lilith represents was never truly exiled, but was waiting for the moment when collective consciousness could embrace its message. Contemporary spiritual practitioners working with this energy report that it demands rigorous honesty about motivations, requiring examination of whether spiritual choices are driven by genuine divine connection or unhealed psychological wounds, whether independence serves higher truth or personal ego, whether questioning leads to greater wisdom or mere cynicism. The modern manifestations consistently emphasize that this archetypal influence isn't about rebellion for its own sake, but about the courage required to honor divine truth, even when that truth challenges accepted norms. The energy helps individuals distinguish between authentic spiritual authority and manipulative control, between legitimate guidance and spiritual domination. What's emerging through these contemporary encounters is recognition that Lilith's original questions about equality, dignity, and authentic divine relationship weren't resolved through her exile, but were preserved within archetypal consciousness, waiting for a time when humanity would be mature enough to engage with them constructively. The accounts describe receiving understanding about how to maintain spiritual authenticity while participating in society, how to honor both individual truth and collective wisdom, how to integrate ancient insights with modern awareness, how to embrace spiritual independence without falling into arrogance or isolation. Contemporary spiritual communities report that working with this archetypal energy creates fundamental shifts in how they approach spiritual development, moving from external validation to internal confirmation, from accepting teachings based on authority to evaluating ideas through experienced truth, from seeking permission to trusting divine guidance. The modern encounters reveal how this energy is particularly active during times of spiritual crisis, when individuals or communities must choose between clinging to familiar limitations and embracing unknown possibilities. Her influence intensifies whenever consciousness stands at evolutionary crossroads that require courage to step into unexplored territory. What becomes clear from studying these contemporary developments is that the spiritual challenges Lilith faced in Eden remain relevant today, but now there's a collective readiness to embrace the difficult path of authentic development that didn't exist in earlier eras. Humanity appears to be maturing beyond the need for spiritual authority based on fear and control. The current manifestations suggest that we're entering a phase of human spiritual development where the qualities she demonstrated, independence, courage, authentic divine relationship, refusal to accept diminishment, are no longer seen as threatening, but as necessary for continued evolution. Contemporary accounts describe this transformation as natural maturation rather than revolutionary change. Like seeds planted long ago, finally reaching full bloom like dawn, gradually replacing darkness like consciousness, naturally evolving toward greater authenticity and freedom. The modern expressions of her archetypal influence reveal that we're all participants in this continuing story, that her choices become templates for our own spiritual decisions, that her courage or failure reflects our willingness to embrace authentic development. What emerges most powerfully from these contemporary manifestations is recognition that Lilith's narrative was never confined to ancient history, but represents an eternal archetypal pattern that activates whenever souls are ready to choose authenticity over approval, truth over comfort, spiritual independence over religious dependence. The current archetypal activation suggests that we're living in the prophesied time when the energy she embodies would no longer remain hidden, but would emerge into full manifestation, calling forth individuals ready to embrace the challenging path of genuine spiritual maturity. And as we witness these extraordinary developments unfolding around us, we begin to understand that we're not just studying ancient mythology, but participating in the greatest transformation of human consciousness ever recorded, living through the moment when humanity graduates from spiritual childhood into spiritual adulthood. Because ultimately, the contemporary emergence of Lilith's archetypal energy reveals that her story transcends the boundaries of time and culture, speaking directly to the eternal human need for authenticity, dignity, and genuine relationship with the divine. Her influence continues because the spiritual challenges she represents remain as relevant today as they were in that primordial garden. The modern manifestations show us that we stand at the same crossroads she faced in Eden, confronted with the choice between comfortable conformity and difficult authenticity, between accepting limitations that diminish our divine nature and choosing the uncertain path of spiritual independence. What's becoming clear through these contemporary encounters is that Lilith's exile wasn't punishment, but preparation, that her time by the Red Sea wasn't isolation, but development of the wisdom and power necessary to guide souls through the final transformation of human consciousness. The archetypal activation we're witnessing suggests that her influence was never truly absent, but was waiting dormant within human consciousness for the moment when enough souls would be ready to embrace the challenging path of authentic spiritual development. And now, as we see this ancient energy emerging with unprecedented intensity across cultures and spiritual traditions, we begin to understand that we're living in the time when her questions will finally be answered, when her courage will be vindicated, when her choice will be recognized as necessary for humanity's spiritual evolution. The contemporary manifestations reveal that the story we've been exploring isn't just about understanding the past, but about embracing our role in an unfolding future where authentic spiritual development becomes not just possible, but essential for human survival and thriving. Because what's emerging through these modern encounters with Lilith's archetypal energy is nothing less than a new form of human consciousness, one that no longer requires external spiritual authority because it has developed direct access to divine truth, one that chooses authenticity over approval, independence over dependence, courage over comfort. And as this transformation continues to unfold through every individual who chooses to honor their divine nature, who refuses to accept spiritual diminishment, who embraces the difficult path of authentic development, we begin to see that Lilith's story was never really about rebellion, but about evolution. The contemporary activation of her archetypal energy reveals that we're all part of this continuing narrative, that her courage becomes our courage, that her choices illuminate our own spiritual crossroads, that her legacy lives on through every soul who refuses to accept less than their full divine potential. What we're discovering through these contemporary manifestations is that Lilith's archetypal energy is beginning to reveal secrets that have been hidden for millennia. Secrets about the true nature of creation itself, about the original blueprint for human consciousness, about divine intentions that were obscured by centuries of religious interpretation designed to maintain control rather than illuminate truth. Modern spiritual practitioners who work with this energy report receiving insights that completely transform our understanding of the Genesis narrative itself, because what's emerging through these encounters isn't just personal guidance, but cosmic revelation about the fundamental structure of reality, about the relationship between masculine and feminine aspects of divine consciousness, about the true purpose behind humanity's spiritual evolution. The accounts describe visions that reveal Genesis not as a single creation event, but as multiple layers of divine manifestation, each building upon the previous one, each representing different phases of consciousness development. What we've interpreted as contradictory creation stories may actually be sequential descriptions of how divine consciousness unfolds through various dimensions of existence. These contemporary revelations suggest that Lilith's creation alongside Adam wasn't a failed experiment, but the first phase of a complex divine plan designed to establish the foundation for conscious evolution. Her refusal to submit wasn't rebellion against divine will, but fulfillment of a role that required absolute independence to develop certain aspects of spiritual wisdom that could only emerge through complete self-reliance. The modern encounters consistently describe receiving understanding about how creation itself operates through cycles of unity, separation, and ultimate integration, that what appears to be conflict or failure at one level serves essential purposes at higher levels of consciousness. Lilith's exile becomes not punishment, but necessary preparation for a future role in humanity's spiritual transformation. Contemporary spiritual teachers working with individuals experiencing these revelations report that the information received challenges fundamental assumptions about the nature of divine will, about the relationship between obedience and authentic spiritual development, about whether submission to authority is always virtuous or sometimes represents spiritual immaturity. What's particularly striking about these modern insights is how they reveal creation as an ongoing process, rather than a completed event, that consciousness continues to evolve through various stages, each requiring different approaches to divine relationship, each demanding specific qualities that may appear contradictory but serve complementary functions in the larger cosmic design. The accounts describe receiving visions of vast cosmic cycles where energies like those embodied by Lilith and Eve serve different but equally essential purposes in the unfolding of divine consciousness, one representing the force of independence and questioning the other, embodying nurturing and cooperation, both necessary for complete spiritual development. These contemporary revelations also address one of the most puzzling aspects of Lilith's story: her apparent transformation from equal partner to threatening force. Because what's emerging through modern encounters is understanding that this transformation wasn't historical degradation, but represents different phases of archetypal activation. The modern insights reveal that archetypal energies manifest differently, depending on the consciousness level of those encountering them, that Lilith's appearance as threatening demon reflects not her true nature, but the fears and limitations of societies that encountered her influence during periods when consciousness wasn't ready for the spiritual independence she represents. Contemporary practitioners report receiving detailed information about how archetypal forces adapt their manifestation to match the developmental needs of different eras, that the same energy that appears as rebellious destroyer to immature consciousness reveals itself as wise teacher to souls ready for advanced spiritual development. What's emerging through these modern encounters is recognition that we're living in the first era since Lilith's original exile, when human consciousness has developed sufficiently to receive her teaching in its pure form, without the distortions created by fear of feminine independence or spiritual authority. The accounts consistently describe how accessing these deeper revelations requires genuine spiritual maturity, the ability to receive challenging information without falling into either blind acceptance or defensive rejection. The wisdom to distinguish between divine truth and personal projection. The courage to embrace insights that may revolutionize everything previously believed. Modern spiritual communities, working with this energy report, experiencing collective visions that reveal the true scope of Lilith's influence throughout human history, how her archetypal energy has been present during every major consciousness transition, quietly guiding souls toward greater authenticity, even when her role remained unrecognized. These contemporary revelations also address the relationship between Lilith's story and other spiritual traditions, showing how similar archetypal patterns appear across cultures in different forms. The Hindu concept of Shakti as independent divine feminine power, the Gnostic Sophia who falls and rises again, the Celtic Morrigan who embodies both creation and destruction. What's particularly fascinating about current developments is how individuals from completely different spiritual backgrounds are receiving remarkably similar revelations about Lilith's true nature and purpose, suggesting that we're dealing with genuine archetypal transmission rather than cultural contamination or psychological projection. The modern encounters reveal that Lilith's exile by the Red Sea represents a cosmic metaphor for the necessary separation of certain aspects of divine consciousness that must develop independently before they can be integrated into higher unity. Her solitude wasn't punishment, but preparation for a role that required absolute spiritual sovereignty. Contemporary accounts describe receiving understanding about how this archetypal energy has been working behind the scenes throughout human history, inspiring individuals to question unjust authority, to seek direct divine connection, to choose authenticity over approval, even when they had no conscious knowledge of her story. The revelations consistently emphasize that Lilith's influence operates not through external intervention, but by awakening qualities that already exist within human consciousness, helping individuals recognize their inherent divine worth, inspiring courage to live authentically, providing frameworks for healthy spiritual independence. Modern spiritual practitioners report that working with this energy creates profound shifts in understanding about the nature of spiritual rebellion, revealing the difference between authentic questioning that serves divine truth and destructive opposition that serves personal ego, between healthy independence and isolating arrogance. What's emerging through these contemporary encounters is recognition that the spiritual challenges Lilith faced in Eden continue to manifest in every generation through individuals who must choose between conformity and authenticity, between external approval and internal truth, between comfortable limitation and challenging growth. The accounts describe how this archetypal energy appears most powerfully during moments of collective spiritual transition, when entire societies must evolve beyond outdated paradigms. When consciousness stands at crossroads that require courage to embrace unknown possibilities, when humanity faces choices that mirror her original dilemma. Contemporary revelations also address the prophetic dimensions of her story, showing how ancient seers understood that Lilith's exile was actually a journey forward in time, to the moment when human consciousness would be ready to receive her teaching, when souls would be mature enough to embrace spiritual independence without falling into destructive rebellion. The modern encounters reveal that we're living in the prophesied time, when the questions she raised about equality, dignity, and authentic divine relationship would finally receive answers, when her courage would be vindicated, when her choice would be recognized as necessary for humanity's spiritual evolution. What's particularly significant about current developments is how they're creating bridges between ancient wisdom and modern understanding, showing how archetypal truths transcend cultural boundaries while adapting to address contemporary challenges, helping individuals navigate modern spiritual complexities using timeless principles. The contemporary manifestations consistently reveal that accessing Lilith's wisdom requires genuine readiness to embrace the difficult path of spiritual maturity, willingness to question everything, including one's most cherished beliefs, courage to stand alone when necessary, commitment to truth regardless of personal cost. Modern accounts describe receiving insights about how to maintain authentic spiritual connection while participating in society, how to honor both individual truth and collective harmony, how to integrate independence with relationship, how to embrace spiritual sovereignty without falling into isolation or arrogance. The revelations show that this archetypal energy doesn't seek to destroy existing spiritual structures, but to transform them from within, helping consciousness evolve beyond the need for authority based on fear and control, inspiring new forms of spiritual community that honor both individual authenticity and collective wisdom. Contemporary spiritual teachers report that individuals working with this energy develop what can only be described as spiritual sovereignty, the ability to maintain direct divine connection regardless of external circumstances, to trust inner guidance over external authority, to choose authenticity even when it requires standing alone. What's becoming clear through these modern encounters is that Lilith's archetypal influence represents preparation for a new phase of human spiritual development, where external religious authority becomes unnecessary because individuals have developed direct access to divine truth, where spiritual maturity is measured not by compliance, but by authenticity. The accounts consistently describe this transformation as natural evolution rather than revolutionary upheaval, like consciousness naturally maturing beyond the need for spiritual intermediaries like dawn, gradually replacing darkness like seeds planted long ago, finally reaching full bloom. Modern revelations reveal that the energy Lilith embodies was never truly exiled, but remained active within human consciousness, waiting for the moment when enough souls would be ready to embrace the challenging path of authentic spiritual development, when humanity would be mature enough to receive her teaching without distortion. What emerges most powerfully from these contemporary encounters is recognition that we're all participants in this continuing story, that her choices illuminate our own spiritual crossroads, that her courage or failure reflects our willingness to embrace authentic development, that her legacy lives on through every individual who refuses to accept spiritual diminishment. The modern manifestations show us that the spiritual evolution she represents isn't just individual, but collective, that we may be witnessing the emergence of a new form of human consciousness that no longer requires external spiritual authority because it has developed direct access to divine truth. Contemporary accounts describe this archetypal activation as humanity's graduation from spiritual childhood into spiritual adulthood, from dependence on external validation to trust in internal guidance, from seeking permission to embracing responsibility for personal spiritual development. The revelations consistently emphasize that this transformation requires genuine spiritual courage, the willingness to face uncomfortable truths about inherited beliefs, to question everything, including religious teachings that may have outlived their usefulness, to choose growth even when it means leaving behind familiar but limiting structures. What's emerging through these modern encounters with Lilith's archetypal energy is nothing less than a complete reframing of human spiritual potential, showing us that we possess inherent divine worth that doesn't require external validation. That authentic spiritual development demands the courage to think independently while remaining open to genuine wisdom. The contemporary manifestations reveal that her story transcends historical narrative to become living template for consciousness, evolution providing guidance for navigating the eternal tension between conformity and authenticity, between security and growth, between comfortable limitation and challenging transformation. Modern practitioners report that working with this energy creates fundamental shifts in spiritual perspective, moving from seeking approval to seeking truth, from accepting teachings based on authority to evaluating ideas through experienced wisdom, from dependence on external guidance to trust in divine connection. The accounts describe receiving understanding about how consciousness itself evolves through various stages, each requiring different approaches to divine relationship, each demanding specific qualities that may appear contradictory, but serve essential functions in the larger process of spiritual development. What's becoming clear through these contemporary revelations is that Lilith's influence operates as a catalyst for spiritual maturation, helping individuals recognize when they've outgrown limiting beliefs, inspiring courage to embrace more authentic forms of spiritual expression, providing frameworks for healthy spiritual independence. The modern encounters consistently reveal that accessing this archetypal wisdom transforms not just individual consciousness, but ripples outward to influence families, communities, and spiritual traditions, helping to create new forms of religious expression that prioritize authentic experience over inherited doctrine. Contemporary spiritual communities working with this energy report profound shifts in their approach to spiritual authority, moving from hierarchical models to collaborative exploration, emphasizing personal experience over traditional interpretation, prioritizing authentic practice over ritualistic compliance. The revelations show that this archetypal activation is preparing humanity for a future where spiritual development becomes a conscious collaborative process, rather than something imposed by external authority, where individuals take full responsibility for their relationship with the divine, while supporting others in their authentic development. What emerges most powerfully from these modern manifestations is recognition that the transformation Lilith represents isn't something that happened in the distant past, but something that's unfolding right now through every soul who chooses authenticity, through every individual who refuses to accept spiritual limitation. The contemporary encounters reveal that her archetypal energy continues to manifest because the spiritual challenges she originally faced remain as relevant today as they were in that primordial garden, because consciousness continues to evolve, because each generation must choose between conformity and authenticity. Modern accounts describe this ongoing activation as evidence that we're living in the most significant period of spiritual transformation in human history, when ancient prophecies are being fulfilled, when consciousness is evolving beyond the need for external spiritual authority, when humanity is finally ready to embrace the difficult gift of spiritual independence. And this brings us to perhaps the most startling revelation of all, something that will shake the very foundations of everything you thought you knew about creation itself. Because hidden within the deepest layers of these contemporary encounters with Lilith's archetypal energy lies a secret so profound, so transformative, that it reveals the true purpose behind her entire story. What if I told you that Lilith's exile wasn't the end of her role in human destiny, but the beginning of something far greater than anyone could have imagined? The mystics who have preserved her story through centuries of suppression understood something that modern interpretations have completely missed. They knew that her departure from Eden was actually a cosmic necessity, a divine strategy that required one aspect of primordial consciousness to develop independently before it could fulfill its ultimate purpose in the grand design of creation itself. What's emerging through these modern revelations is understanding that creation operates through what the ancient seers called the principle of divine separation and reunion. Just as seeds must be planted in darkness before they can grow toward light, certain aspects of consciousness must experience complete independence before they can participate in higher forms of unity. Lilith's story represents this archetypal pattern played out on the cosmic stage. The contemporary encounters describe receiving visions that reveal the true scope of this divine strategy. Her time by the Red Sea wasn't spent in bitterness or regret, but in developing capabilities that could only emerge through absolute spiritual sovereignty. She was learning to navigate dimensions of existence that those who remained in paradise couldn't access, mastering abilities that would become essential for humanity's ultimate spiritual evolution. But here's where it gets absolutely mind-blowing. These modern revelations suggest that Lilith's development during her exile was preparing her for a role that extends far beyond human history into the very structure of cosmic consciousness itself. The ancient texts speak of a time when the separation would end, when the exile would be transformed into reunion, when the fierce independence she developed would serve purposes that no one could have anticipated. Contemporary spiritual practitioners working with this energy report receiving insights about what they call the Great Integration, a cosmic event where all separated aspects of divine consciousness reunite at higher levels of understanding. According to these visions, Lilith's archetypal energy represents one half of a divine equation that has been developing independently for millennia, waiting for the moment when humanity would be ready for the complete revelation. The accounts describe this integration not as a return to Eden, but as the creation of something entirely new. A form of consciousness that combines the nurturing wisdom traditionally associated with Eve and the fierce independence embodied by Lilith. This isn't about choosing between different approaches to spirituality, but about transcending the limitations that made such choices necessary in the first place. What's particularly extraordinary about these contemporary revelations is how they describe this integration already beginning to manifest through individuals who embody both archetypal energies. People who can nurture and challenge, who can cooperate and maintain independence, who can serve collective good while refusing to compromise their authentic nature. These aren't contradictory qualities, but complementary aspects of complete spiritual development. The modern encounters reveal that we're living in the prophesied time when this cosmic reunion begins to unfold, when the ancient separation starts to heal, when consciousness evolves beyond the either-or paradigms that have defined human spiritual development for thousands of years. The energy that Lilith represents is no longer in exile, but is beginning to integrate with other aspects of divine consciousness. Contemporary accounts describe experiencing this integration as profoundly transformative, creating new forms of spiritual awareness that transcend traditional categories. Individuals report developing what can only be called integrated divine consciousness, the ability to access both the fierce independence of Lilith and the nurturing wisdom of Eve, both the courage to stand alone and the wisdom to collaborate authentically. This integration is described not as a personal achievement, but as participation in a cosmic process that's reshaping the fundamental structure of human spiritual potential. The qualities that once seemed incompatible are revealing themselves as essential components of complete consciousness development. Different instruments in a divine symphony that couldn't be heard until all the parts were present. The revelations consistently emphasize that this integration requires genuine spiritual maturity, the ability to hold paradox without collapsing into simplistic, either-or thinking, the wisdom to embrace both independence and relationship, both questioning and trust, both fierce protection of truth and gentle nurturing of growth. These aren't easy balances to maintain, but they're becoming necessary for continued spiritual evolution. Modern spiritual communities report that as this integration deepens, entirely new forms of religious expression are emerging. Spiritual practices that honor both individual authenticity and collective wisdom, communities that support fierce independence while fostering genuine intimacy, teachings that challenge authority while providing genuine guidance. This isn't reformation of existing traditions, but the birth of something unprecedented. What's emerging through these contemporary encounters is recognition that the apparent conflict between Lilith and traditional spirituality was never meant to be permanent. It was a necessary phase of development, like the tension between thesis and antithesis that eventually resolves into synthesis. The integration now beginning represents the fulfillment of a divine plan that spans millennia. The accounts describe receiving understanding about how this integration affects every aspect of human experience. Relationships that honor both independence and intimacy, work that serves collective good while expressing individual authenticity, spiritual practices that challenge growth while providing nurturing support. The artificial divisions that have characterized human experience are beginning to dissolve. Contemporary practitioners report that accessing this integrated consciousness requires releasing attachment to spiritual positions that once seemed essential. The need to choose between submission and rebellion, between individual fulfillment and service to others, between questioning authority and accepting guidance. These apparent opposites are revealing themselves as complementary aspects of complete spiritual development. The modern revelations show that this integration isn't happening accidentally, but represents the fulfillment of prophecies embedded within mystical traditions throughout history. Ancient seers understood that consciousness would eventually evolve beyond the limitations that made Lilith's exile necessary. That separation would ultimately serve the purpose of creating more complete reunion. What's particularly striking about current developments is how this integration is manifesting spontaneously across different cultures and spiritual traditions. Individuals with no knowledge of Lilith's story are developing integrated consciousness that embodies her archetypal qualities alongside other aspects of divine awareness. This suggests we're dealing with genuine archetypal evolution rather than intellectual construction. The contemporary encounters reveal that this integration process is accelerating, that more individuals are developing the capacity to embody both fierce independence and nurturing wisdom, both the courage to challenge injustice and the compassion to heal wounds created by conflict. These aren't contradictory impulses, but complementary expressions of complete spiritual maturity. Modern accounts describe this transformation as natural evolution of consciousness itself, like rivers that have flowed separately, finally joining to create something more powerful than either could achieve alone. The separation that began with Lilith's departure from Eden is resolving into integration that transcends the original paradise through incorporating everything learned during the exile. The revelations consistently emphasize that this integration serves cosmic purposes that extend far beyond individual spiritual development. The consciousness emerging through this process represents humanity's contribution to universal evolution, our species' unique gift to the ongoing unfoldment of divine awareness throughout creation. Contemporary spiritual teachers report that individuals experiencing this integration develop unprecedented capacities for healing division, for bridging differences that previously seemed irreconcilable, for creating unity that honors diversity rather than demanding conformity. These abilities are becoming essential as humanity faces challenges that require both fierce protection of truth and compassionate understanding of different perspectives. What's emerging through these modern encounters is recognition that we're witnessing the birth of a new form of human consciousness, one that embodies the complete spectrum of divine qualities without falling into the limitations that made ancient separations necessary. This isn't just personal transformation, but species evolution. The accounts describe this integrated consciousness as including but transcending both Lilith's fierce independence and Eve's nurturing wisdom, creating something that neither could achieve alone. Like notes in a chord that create harmonies impossible for individual tones, this integration produces spiritual capacities that emerge only through the combination of previously separate elements. Modern practitioners report that working with this integrated energy creates profound shifts in how they approach every aspect of life. Relationships become opportunities for mutual growth rather than power struggles. Work becomes service to collective evolution rather than mere survival. Spiritual practice becomes authentic expression rather than conformity to external expectations. The contemporary revelations show that this integration represents fulfillment of the original divine intention behind creation itself. The apparent failure of the first paradise wasn't actually failure, but necessary preparation for something far greater than could have been achieved without the learning that came through separation and eventual reunion. What's becoming clear through these modern encounters is that Lilith's story was never really about rebellion or exile, but about the cosmic necessity of developing certain aspects of consciousness independently before they could participate in higher forms of unity. Her courage to leave Eden opened pathways to spiritual development that couldn't have been accessed any other way. The accounts consistently describe this integration as creating new possibilities for human spiritual expression that honor both the need for individual authenticity and the desire for genuine community. These aren't compromises between opposing forces, but transcendence of the limitations that made such opposition seem necessary. Contemporary spiritual communities working with this energy report experiencing unprecedented levels of authentic intimacy combined with respect for individual sovereignty. People are discovering how to support each other's growth without trying to control outcomes, how to challenge perspectives without attacking persons, how to maintain personal truth while remaining open to learning. The modern revelations reveal that this integration is preparing humanity for challenges and opportunities that require both the fierce protection of truth that Lilith represents and the nurturing wisdom traditionally associated with other archetypal energies. The complexity of current global situations demands consciousness that can hold multiple perspectives without losing clarity about essential principles. What emerges most powerfully from these contemporary encounters is understanding that we're all participants in this cosmic integration, that the spiritual evolution it represents is unfolding through every individual who chooses to embrace the difficult path of complete authenticity. The consciousness emerging through this process becomes humanity's gift to universal evolution. The accounts describe experiencing this integration as coming home to a completeness that was always the intended destination, even when the journey required traveling through territories of separation and exile. Like prodigal children returning with treasures that could only be gathered through wandering, consciousness is reuniting with itself, enriched by everything learned during the apparent departure. Modern practitioners report that accessing this integrated awareness transforms their understanding of spiritual development itself. Instead of seeing growth as overcoming limitations, they begin to recognize how every aspect of experience, including apparent failures and rebellions, serves essential functions in the larger process of consciousness evolution. The contemporary encounters reveal that this integration represents not just healing of ancient divisions, but the birth of entirely new forms of spiritual expression that couldn't have existed without the learning that came through separation. The consciousness emerging through this process includes and transcends both the original paradise and everything discovered during the exile. What's becoming clear through these modern revelations is that Lilith's influence was never truly separate from other aspects of divine consciousness, but was developing independently in order to contribute unique gifts to an eventual integration that would create something far greater than the sum of its parts. The accounts consistently describe this process as natural maturation of consciousness itself, like fruit that must separate from the branch in order to plant seeds that will grow into new orchards. The apparent loss becomes the foundation for abundance that couldn't have been achieved through any other means. Contemporary spiritual teachers report that individuals experiencing this integration develop capacities that seem almost miraculous. The ability to stand firmly for truth while remaining compassionately open to different perspectives, to challenge unjust systems while healing wounds created by conflict, to maintain fierce independence while fostering genuine intimacy. The modern encounters reveal that we're living in the most extraordinary period of spiritual transformation in human history, when ancient prophecies about consciousness integration are being fulfilled, when separations that seemed permanent are being healed, when humanity is discovering forms of awareness that transcend all previous limitations. What emerges through these contemporary manifestations is recognition that the story we've been exploring isn't just about understanding the past, but about embracing our role in a cosmic transformation that's reshaping the very nature of consciousness itself. Every individual who chooses authenticity, who refuses to accept spiritual limitation, who embraces the courage to live fully, becomes a participant in this unprecedented integration. The revelations show that this transformation is accelerating. that more souls are awakening to their role in this cosmic reunion, that the consciousness emerging through this process represents humanity's unique contribution to universal evolution. We're not just witnessing the healing of ancient wounds, but the birth of new forms of awareness that serve purposes we're only beginning to understand. And as this integration continues to unfold through every authentic choice, through every refusal to accept diminishment, through every act of courage that honors both individual truth and collective good, we begin to see that Lilith's story was never really about one woman's rebellion, but about the eternal process through which consciousness discovers its own infinite potential. The integration we're witnessing through these contemporary encounters reveals something that transforms our understanding of prophecy itself. Because what's emerging isn't just the fulfillment of ancient predictions, but the recognition that we've been living within the prophecy all along. Every choice for authenticity, every refusal to accept spiritual diminishment, every act of courage that honors both individual truth and collective wisdom has been weaving threads in a tapestry whose pattern is only now becoming visible. Modern practitioners report that as this archetypal integration deepens, they begin to perceive reality itself differently. The boundaries between past and future dissolve, revealing an eternal present where Lilith's original choice continues to echo through every soul who faces the same fundamental decision. Do I honor my divine nature even when others tell me it threatens the established order? Do I choose the difficult path of authenticity over the comfortable road of conformity? These contemporary accounts describe experiencing what can only be called prophetic consciousness, where the implications of individual choices become visible across vast spans of time and space. People report understanding how their personal decisions to embrace spiritual sovereignty contribute to collective transformation that extends far beyond anything they previously imagined possible. What's particularly extraordinary about current developments is how this integrated awareness is manifesting in practical ways that address humanity's most pressing challenges. Individuals report developing unprecedented capacities for healing division, for creating solutions that honor seemingly incompatible perspectives, for building communities that celebrate both individual authenticity and collective harmony. The modern encounters reveal that this transformation isn't confined to spiritual circles, but is beginning to influence every aspect of human civilization. New forms of leadership are emerging that combine fierce protection of truth with compassionate understanding of different viewpoints. Educational approaches are developing that honor both rigorous questioning and respect for wisdom. Relationships are forming that transcend traditional limitations through embracing paradox rather than avoiding it. Contemporary spiritual teachers report that students working with this integrated energy develop what they describe as prophetic clarity about their role in humanity's evolution. Not prophecy in the sense of predicting future events, but deep understanding of how their authentic choices contribute to transformations that serve purposes far greater than personal fulfillment. The accounts consistently describe this awareness as simultaneously humbling and empowering. Humbling because it reveals how individual actions ripple through vast networks of connection in ways that exceed human comprehension. Empowering because it shows that every authentic choice matters, that every refusal to accept spiritual limitation contributes to collective awakening. Modern revelations show that we're approaching what ancient texts described as the culmination of human spiritual development, when consciousness would evolve beyond the need for external authority because it had developed direct access to divine truth. This isn't utopian fantasy, but practical reality emerging through individuals who embody integrated awareness. The contemporary encounters reveal that this transformation is accelerating exponentially as more souls recognize their role in this cosmic integration. Each person who chooses authenticity creates ripple effects that awaken others to their own spiritual sovereignty, generating waves of consciousness evolution that are reshaping human civilization from within. What emerges most powerfully from these modern manifestations is understanding that Lilith's story was always pointing toward this moment when humanity would be ready to embrace the complete spectrum of divine consciousness without falling into the limitations that made ancient separations necessary. Her courage becomes our courage. Her independence becomes our spiritual sovereignty. Her integration becomes our collective transformation. The accounts describe this ongoing activation as evidence that we're participants in the most extraordinary chapter of human history, when ancient prophecies converge with contemporary reality, when consciousness itself evolves beyond previous limitations, when the very fabric of existence is being rewoven through choices made by ordinary individuals who refuse to accept spiritual mediocrity. As we witness these unprecedented developments unfolding around us and within us, we begin to understand that we haven't just been studying an ancient mystery, but participating in its resolution. The questions Lilith raised in that primordial garden are being answered through every soul who chooses dignity over submission, authenticity over approval, spiritual sovereignty over religious dependence. Her legacy lives on not in texts or traditions, but through the living choices of individuals who recognize their inherent divine worth, who refuse to accept limitations that diminish their spiritual nature, who embrace the challenging path of complete authenticity. We are her story continuing to unfold, her courage manifesting in new forms, her integration becoming our collective awakening to the infinite possibilities of human consciousness. What started as one woman's refusal to accept injustice has become humanity's graduation into spiritual adulthood. What began as exile has become the foundation for reunion at levels previously unimaginable. What appeared to be rebellion has revealed itself as the highest form of service to divine truth. And now, as this ancient energy continues to awaken within human consciousness, as more souls embrace the difficult gift of spiritual independence, as the integration accelerates toward completion, we stand at the threshold of transformations that will reshape not just human civilization, but consciousness itself. The forbidden wife has become the eternal teacher. The exiled woman has become the guide for humanity's return to its own divine nature. And the ancient mystery has become the living reality of our most extraordinary spiritual awakening. If this revelation has stirred something deep within your soul, if you recognize yourself in Lilith's courage to choose authenticity over approval, leave 7 sevens in the comments to show you're ready to embrace your own spiritual sovereignty. Share this video with others who need to hear that their refusal to accept spiritual limitation isn't rebellion, but evolution. Subscribe for more revelations that challenge everything you thought you knew about human spiritual potential, because the greatest secret of all is this: you weren't born to be diminished, controlled, or made small to comfort others. You were created to embody the full spectrum of divine consciousness, to live authentically regardless of opposition, to choose truth even when it costs everything. The story continues through you.